Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the museum. I've been here for over 30 years, so I've, needless to say, stood at this podium more than a few times, but this is truly an inspirational, not only see all the people in the crowd here, but the subject we're covering today, which is a very special event in U.S. Navy history. Her story began far from the depths of the Pacific. That is her final resting place. It began actually around a conference table in Washington, D.C. in 1922, as negotiators for the world's great naval powers, intent on preventing another global war, sought to limit ship construction. One class of vessels allowed were so-called treaty cruisers, which, as was standard practice in the Navy, were named after cities around the United States. One of the names chosen was Indianapolis. She was not the first naval vessel named after the Indiana state capital. A steamer, having served in 1918 and 1919 and made voyages between the United States and Europe in the aftermath of World War I. This second ship was constructed for war, her deck bristling with guns, though ironically, her most famous voyage would be delivering a most unique cargo. Her sponsor was the daughter of a U.S. senator from Indiana who smashed the traditional bottle of champagne against the ship's hull on the occasion of her christening at the New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey on November 7th, 1931. Just over a year later, the ship was placed in commission at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. The cost of construction was $10.5 million, or $243.4 million today. I hope the Indianapolis never will be called upon to fire a hostile shot, read a message from the Secretary of the Navy. Nevertheless, I hope she will always be ready. The first commanding officer of the ship was Captain John Smealey, who as an ensign in 1907 served as an engineering officer on board a destroyer, the USS Decatur, along with another officer whose name you probably recognize, Ensign Chester W. Nimitz. The commissioning occurred just days after Americans went to the polls and elected Franklin D. Roosevelt as the 32nd President of the United States. Ship and Commander-in-Chief would form indelible ties almost immediately. On July 1st, 1933, USS Indianapolis steamed to the waters off Campobello Island in Maine, where 12 years earlier, FDR contracted polio, to pick up the newly inaugurated Commander-in-Chief to transport him to Annapolis. Later that year, the ship embarked the Secretary of the Navy, Claude Swanson, for a tour of the Pacific, transiting the Panama Canal, stopping in California, and ultimately reaching Hawaii. There is no more possibility of the United States entering a war in the Pacific Ocean than any place else in the world, the Secretary of the Navy commented to reporters, going on to state that he was much pleased after inspecting a naval installation whose name would actually symbolize U.S. entry into just such a war, Pearl Harbor. Upon return to the West Coast, the cruiser became a flagship for the scouting force, the first of many times that an admiral's flag flew from her mast. Indianapolis steamed to Atlantic waters in 1934 for another rendezvous with Franklin D. Roosevelt, serving as the platform of his review for the fleet entrance into New York Harbor. With battle flags flying, the review of ships stretched 12 miles, a newspaper correspondent recording the scene on board USS Indianapolis. While the cruiser steamed cautiously through the lifting haze, the president remained at his station beside the forward gun turret, where he stood while the fleet passed. For nearly an hour, the ships passed, all the men in full dress uniform and the rails manned. As each vessel drew abreast the president, the crew came to a hand salute. The guard presented arms, the band played the national anthem, and each saluting ship gave the presidential salute of 21 guns fired at 5-second intervals. 2 years later, Indianapolis embarked FDR again at Charleston, South Carolina, transporting him to South America on a month-long scheduled visit to that region. Along the way, he underwent the time-honored crossing the line ceremony as the cruiser crossed the equator, transforming with many sailors on board from a lowly pollywog to a shellback and welcomed into the realm of King Neptune. One of the charges issued against the president by the royal court was that he had been masquerading as a man of the sea for many years, including his stint as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The commanding officer of the cruiser on this voyage was Captain Kent Hewitt, who as an admiral during World War II under FDR, commanded naval forces that put Allied forces ashore at places like North Africa, Italy, and southern France. The hope that Indianapolis would never be called upon to fire a shot was shattered on Sunday, December 7th, 1941. That morning, the cruiser was conducting a simulated bombardment of Johnston Island, nearly 1,000 miles away. Over the course of the ensuing years, she would never be far from the action. She escorted aircraft carriers on early raids in the Pacific, including an airstrike against Japanese shipping in New Guinea on March 10, 1942. Sailors on her deck may very well have watched from a distance as the SBD Dauntless dive bomber, which is actually sitting right over there, launched from the flight deck of USS Lexington. Her guns echoed across the water, supporting troops going ashore in the Aleutian Islands and at such hallowed battlegrounds as Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. She served as the flagship for Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, during these actions, and at a battle called the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which aviators named the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On March 31st, 1945, as USS Indianapolis prepared to support the invasion of Okinawa the following day, Lookout spotted a lone Japanese fighter plane approaching. The ship's anti-aircraft gunners had just seconds to get their bearing, and their fire was true. Shells from 20 millimeters hit the attacker, causing the airplane to swerve, but the pilot managed to release his bomb just 25 feet above the deck and crash his airplane into the ship. The bomb passed completely through Indianapolis before exploding in the water directly underneath her hull, blowing 2 holes in the bottom and killing 9 members of her crew. Well, today the thing we have dreaded happened. It's just a miracle that we didn't catch fire, or there would have been more casualties, a sailor wrote in the aftermath. But despite the damage, the crew saved their ship, and Indianapolis limped across the Pacific under her own power, eventually reaching the Mare Island Navy Yard for repairs. Had she not been hit, she would have likely remained in the Western Pacific, battle-weary, but on the doorstep of Japan. Instead, fate made the ship and her crew available for that special voyage that took her from the West Coast to Tinian and then Guam, from which she set sail alone on July 28, 1945.
Good morning. I'm Jane Martin, and I have the privilege and the honor to talk about my mother, Lieutenant J.G. Susan Johnson. Oh, I'm getting feedback. My mother kept a diary of her time on the USS Tranquility during World War II. My mother served in the United States Navy during World War II. She was a nurse aboard the USS Tranquility during the battles against Japanese in the Pacific Theater. In August 1945, she helped care for the survivors of the sinking of the USS Indianapolis. The USS Tranquility transported the survivors from, excuse me, I can't say if I can say these words correctly, Palau to Guam. The nurses and the Navy corpsmen were unsung heroes of this event. My mother was commissioned in the Navy Nurses Corps in September 1943. Her initial assignment was at the Navy Hospital Jacksonville. This is the same hospital that my granddaughter Paisley was born on my mother's birthday. And by the way, she will be 103 right now. She met my husband and my dad, Lieutenant Commander Lloyd Johnson, while at Navy Hospital, Jacksonville. In April 1945, my mother received orders for duty to the new hospital ship, USS Tranquility, in New York City. She had applied for the hospital ship duty months before, and this was her dream job, her dream assignment. On a side note, she probably would have preferred to stay in Jacksonville with her new husband. Tranquility departed New York the first part of May 1945. In her diary, she said she got seasick on the way to Norfolk. She stated, "All I wanted to do was die. I'm sure I'll never make a sailor." In June 14, 1945, the Tranquility reached the Pacific Ocean while going through the while going through the Panama Canal. They arrived in Hawaii on June 27th and departed on July 11th. On July 22nd, they arrived at Utah Atoll in the Carolina Islands and joined the 3rd and 6th Fleet. She states they were the only women in the area with about 30,000 men. On August 3rd at 1830, they were alerted to leave on 2 hours' notice to Palau, an island south of Palau, to pick up the survivors of the cruiser Indianapolis. They got underway at 20:35 for their first errand of mercy. On the evening of July 4th, they arrived at Palau. The following are direct quotes from Lieutenant J.G.'s diary on August 6. "We came to anchor about a mile offshore of Palau, right opposite the Bloody Nose Ridge, which took the Marines 2.5 months to capture. They started embarking patients at 0900. They were brought over to us on Higgins boats, some of them walking up the gangway, while others were brought aboard the jib crate. Everything was carried out very smoothly, and there was not any confusion. The last patient was brought aboard at 12:30, and we left right away." Note, this is the day that McVay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. August 7th, diary entry. "We brought 169 survivors aboard. Most of them are exhausted from being overexposure, with leg ulcers, sunburns. We have a few pneumonias, chemical burns, and lacerations as well. These boys were in the water for 4 days before they were picked up. Many of those not killed in torpedoing lost their minds while in the water and committed suicide. These boys just ate and ate. They are so hungry why at night they have difficulty sleeping." And she said in her diary, "I understand the Indianapolis was carrying the atomic bomb and left it on Titanium. She didn't know that when she went out to pick up the survivors." August 8th, diary entry. "We arrived in Guam this afternoon and were moored at the pier. Took only 2 hours to disembark the patients. There are several naval hospitals on the island, giving it about 10,000 beds." These are some personal observations, remark of a 24-year-old Navy nurse from Vermont, which is over there, a picture of her, that's not her, but she was growing up probably never dreaming of being a Navy nurse on a hospital ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command, a total of 315 survivors were rescued. 169 were transported on the USS Tranquility to Guam. The other 149 survivors were understood to have been discharged to Fleet Hospital number 114. Of the 169 survivors aboard Tranquility, the following is a list of the mission diagnosis. Exhaustion from overexposure, 113. Burns, chemicals from the salt water, 27. Immersion foot, 5. Contusions, 16. Abrasions, 3. Wound lacerations, 3. Fractured hand, 1. Fractured ankle, 1. The following are some of the notes from the history. It appeared that the list that the majority of the sailors presented the effects of prolonged exposure to sun and salt water for a period of 91 hours. A lot of abrasions were caused by the friction of the life jackets and straps. While many of the survivors had been delirious and hallucination before 24 hours before the rescue, none showed any remarkable psychiatric disturbances on the ship. Besides outstanding nursing care by the medical staff, the patients were benefit from air-conditioned ship. The absence of sweating helped them the healing of their skin. On a personal note, in 1944, while in NAS Jacksonville, she met my dad, her husband, Navy aviator, Lieutenant Commander Lloyd Swede Johnson, who was a Black PBY pilot in the VPP 33, who served in Central America and Pacific. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross with the V device. This is a high award for heroism and valor and bravery in the face of enemy. Dad was a flight instructor at NAS Jacksonville when he met my mom. Okay, for you Navy aviators, Dad did a split S in the PBY while trying to get away from the enemy fighter. He returned home with his crew without any injuries. On November 8th, 1945, Susan Johnson left the Navy with her husband, Lieutenant Commander Lloyd Johnson, returned to the farm in Nebraska where they raised the 3 children, Judy, Peter, and myself. The family heritage continued with Peter joining Air Force and flying KC-135. I married an Army captain. Their oldest grandson is a captain in the United States Army as a troop commander, and her brother is a retired Navy aviation boatsman mate, fuel hate 1. I want to say the true heroes are the survivors of the Indianapolis. Thank you very much.
I got a little moved there because I lived this with this kid. So let me start by just saying, my name is Lynn Peach, and I currently teach AP Language and Composition and Leadership at Navarre High School. I have taught for almost 30 years, and as a matter of fact, I recently learned that I taught some of your parents at Ransom when they were 8th graders in my class. Back then, around 1996, an 11-year-old 6th grader walked into my classroom and asked me if I was the teacher who did history fair. As a matter of fact, I was very involved in the history fair. Competitions at the time I had coached gave Ransom several students who had placed or won at the state and national level, and I was very willing to help any student who wanted to really dig into a topic and be successful. Well, this student was a little bit of a legend at Ransom. I had heard of his skills reciting Bible verses. You could name a chapter and a verse, and the kid could recite the lines perfectly. Truthfully, it is a skill I would test often between deep dives into microfiche at the research room in UWF and book stacks, looking for newspaper articles from the 1940s. He'd also been a guest on the David Letterman show. For those of you who are too young to remember, that was a 20th century late night show, wildly popular, and I watched this very brave kid go on national television and perform for the Stupid Human Trick segment. He could jump rope on his pogo stick. From what I knew of him, he was pretty amazing. Anyway, on this day, this student confidently asked me if I could give him some advice about his history fair project. Obviously, that young man was Hunter Scott, and the research he would do about the USS Indianapolis would change history. I was a little apprehensive about the heaviness of the topic because most of my students who went on to compete past the school level were at least 7th and 8th graders. But after a short conversation, I was blown away by this kid's enthusiasm and maturity. And that conversation went something like this. Me. So what's your project about? Hunter. Well, have you watched Jaws? Me. I have. Hunter. Well, I was watching the movie with my parents, and I asked them what ship Captain Quint was talking about. We looked it up, and I really want to know what happened. To tell you that I was intrigued would be an understatement. And I was even more fascinated by Hunter's determination. He had already placed an ad in the Gosport, the base newspaper here on NAS Pensacola at the time, asking for help to locate any known survivors. And one man responded with a reunion list that included names and addresses. As soon as I heard that small fact, I told Hunter he needed to write to every single person on that list asking for information that they were willing to share. And my goodness, did they respond. 4 months, almost daily, Hunter would get mail. It was a teacher's dream. Museum quality artifacts would just appear, and Hunter and his dad would share these incredible nuggets of history with me as they each arrived. Now, if you know anything about history fair projects, you know you have to add all of the sources to the bibliography. And you have to annotate that bibliography with explanations about how that source helped further your research. And I can tell you that Hunter was not a great fan of this part of the project because he was, after all, a 6th grader. We would look at each source together, each letter, each newspaper clipping, each photo, each part of the trial testimony, and on and on and on. And all I wanted him to do was tell me the significance of the source so he could type the information to his bibliography. This is where his age and love for reciting Captain Quint's soliloquy about the sinking of the Indianapolis would supersede his love for annotating sources. Over and over again, I would hear Quint's voice through Hunter. Now look, I teach high school, so bear with me. Japanese submarine slammed 2 torpedoes into her side, Chief. We was coming back from the island of Tinian to late. We just delivered the bomb, the Hiroshima bomb. 1,100 men went into the water. Vessel went down in 12 minutes. Didn't see the first shark for about half an hour. Tiger, 13-footer. All good teachers have to admit when a kid is funny. And let's be honest, Hunter's efforts to distract me from keeping him focused on the most mundane parts of documenting hundreds of primary sources was most definitely funny. But most seriously, I can hardly think of any experience that has been more fulfilling to me as an educator than knowing Hunter's work would go on to shed light on a topic that had been largely overlooked to that point, that his determination to fight for Captain Charles McVay's honor would result in an incredible right that corrected a horrible wrong. Now, my students know I'm here today because I only told them this story just yesterday, and they were shocked that their teacher was part of such a fascinating story. When I think of the series of events that has led us to this day, I am humbled and honored to say that I even had the smallest part of this amazing project. Thank you to the Scotts and to Hunter. And without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you the best Bible verse reciting, pogo stick jump roping, Captain Quint impersonating, historian, naval aviator, and current executive officer for the Naval Consolidated Brig Miramar, my former student and friend, Commander Hunter Scott.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you, Miss Peach. I was actually, part of my story, I was going to try to make the case that, there's nothing unique or special about me that enabled the story that I'm about to tell you. But thank you for that very generous and kind introduction. You made that a much harder case for me to make. So thank you. And also, I still don't like bibliographies. I find them very boring and monotonous. Thank goodness for AI tools and the Purdue OWL that helped me through grad school. But Admiral Hall already went down the list of thank yous that of people that I was planning to thank. So thank you, sir. But there are a couple more people that I just want to draw some attention to. Lieutenant Commander Cash Barber, once again, the 100 years old World War II PBY pilot. It is really an honor to have you with us today. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, sir. It's service members like you who have gone before me that paved the way so that we could be here enjoying the freedom of speech that we enjoy, and be able to accomplish things like the story I'm about to tell you that enabled a middle schooler in Pensacola to use the legislative process to help change military history. So thank you, sir. And then also I want to give a special thank you to Dr. Patty Crisp and Miss Diana Hayden and everyone on the team here and the board at the museum. They started planning this over a year ago. This is 4 years ago, excuse me, thank you. They looped me in about a year ago. So this is a very special event, so thank you very much. Yeah, thanks. This is a very special occasion for me for a bunch of reasons. I was born and raised in Pensacola. I grew up coming to the Naval Aviation Museum, so this is very special. I started my career as a naval aviator here in Pensacola, Florida, a career that I'm very proud of. And much of the story that I'm about to tell you happened here in Pensacola. And today I'm going to tell you two stories, one that took place in 1945, and that's the story of the USS Indianapolis and the unjust court-martial of her captain, Captain McVay, and that's the story about a group of men who I've looked up to most of my life, the men of the USS Indianapolis. It is a story of the greatest sea disaster in the history of the Navy, and also one of the greatest naval military cover-ups. And then the second story is the story of how an 11-year-old boy here in Pensacola, with the help of many people, worked to exonerate an unjustly court-martialed captain and whose history project helped to rewrite history. And as I tell you this story, I've spent almost 30 years reflecting on this. There's one key to success that I think is greater than any other. And that's something that my dad told me when I was in middle school there watching the movie Jaws. And the key to success in any endeavor, he said, is to surround yourself by the right people. The people who love you, who encourage you, who will build you up to help you reach your dreams. And he called those people dream builders. And so the story that I'm about to tell you, the exoneration of Captain McVay and the recognition of the ship's final crew, were only possible because I had so many dream builders and encouragers all along the way. So with that, it was the summer of 1996. I was going into middle school at Ransom Middle School. And I was sitting at the foot of my parents' bed, and my dad and I were watching the movie Jaws. And it came upon a scene in the movie that Miss Peach just described, where Captain Quint talked about the story of the Indianapolis. And for 6 minutes told the story of the greatest sea disaster in naval history. And I was I had watched the movie many times, but I had not paid attention to that story like I did this time. Something was different about this when I watched it. I was getting ready to go into middle school. My parents wanted to teach me how to do research and decided that the National History Day competition, or History Fair as we call it in Florida, would be a great opportunity to do that. So I'd been looking for a topic for most of that summer, and so with that in mind, I watched the scene of Captain Quint tell the story of the Indianapolis. And I stood up afterwards and asked my dad, is that a true story? And honestly, he just moved me in front of the TV and said, I'm not sure, but I'll answer that after the movie. So I stood back in front of the TV and was like, well, actually, I'd like to know. He said, all right, tell you what. He was continuing his education at the University of West Florida. And I said, I'm going to the library next week. I'll take you, and we'll do some research together, and we'll find out. So that's what we did. And I want to paint a picture for you. We lived on the north end of Pensacola. We lived in a relatively small house. I still remember, one of my chores was to vacuum the house, and I could plug the vacuum in and vacuum the whole house without ever having to unplug it. I made good grades, but not perfect grades. Not all of my history projects changed history. In fact, this is the anomaly. I see Mr. Jones sitting over here. He was my European history teacher at PHS. And I love telling this story because I love Mr. Jones, but I wasn't doing the greatest in his AP European history class, and he offered some extra credit for people like me who needed the extra credit. So I took advantage of it, I submitted the extra credit, and then I got my grade back on the extra credit, and I only got partial extra credit back. And so I asked him after class, I was like, hey, I did the extra credit, but I didn't really receive much credit. And he said, well, honestly, it wasn't very good. And I say that because I've had so many teachers and mentors who have given me, direct, honest, and candid feedback all along the way that have helped shape me and have helped shape the story that I'm about to tell you. So my dad made good on his promise. We went to the University of West Florida, and he said, all right, here's this. I didn't really know much about research at the time either. So we went to the World War II commentary section of the library. My dad helped me pull some World War II commentaries. He turned to the index. He said, all right, I want you to look at USS Indianapolis. I want you to write down the page number and everything that you can find out. I'm going to go do my own research. I'll be back in a little while. And he came back, and I didn't really have much written on my paper. And, he thought, typical middle school student, I had just been wasting my time. And I said, no, there's not much written in these World War II commentaries about the USS Indianapolis. So he double-checked my work, and sure enough, there was not. And so it begged the question early on, how could the greatest sea disaster in the history of the Navy not be mentioned, but with the exception of a few footnotes in these major World War II commentaries? And I would discover the answer to that, after about a year of research. And that was that the Navy was so embarrassed by the fact that this ship sank, they withheld the story from the press for weeks and released it on the same day that World War II ended, so the VJ Day headlines would overshadow the story about the greatest loss of life at sea in naval history. And then the Navy took many steps over the years to withhold the story from the press and from the public. But I didn't know that at this time, and I was very curious. So we went to the librarian. They didn't have any books on the Indianapolis. All the books were out of print, so she helped me get some on loan from other libraries. And so I, used the computer there at the library. There was no Google back then, so we did a Yahoo search. And only got, I think, 2 or 3 hits from Yahoo. It was very difficult to find information on what I felt like should have been easy to find, on a subject that I felt like should have been easy to find information on. And so, but what started to happen was I started to have dream builders help me out on this quest. The first being my wonderful parents. And then I went to Ransom Middle School, as Ms. Peach just described the early conversations that I had with her. She went out of her way and even stayed after school to help me do research, proofreading the things that I had written, rewriting the things that I had written, quizzing me, constantly testing my knowledge. And she was better, obviously, she phenomenal, and really a wonderful dream builder who this would not have happened without. But I remember one day in particular where after school had ended, it was just her and I in the classroom, and she typed much faster than I did, so she said, here, let me type, you dictate. And I still remember, I was probably a very annoying student, because she was typing so fast that it was getting the little red squiggly lines under the Microsoft Word because, and I kept pointing out her misspellings as she went until she finally looked at me. She's like, Hunter, I will fix it all when I'm finished. Please don't say anything else about it. It's like, all right. And I didn't. So this research started coming together. She mentioned that but I was having a really tough time finding sources on the Indianapolis. And my mom had the idea. She's like, well, let's put an ad in the local newspaper, the Gosport local Navy newspaper, seeing if anyone can locate a survivor. And that's what we did. And it led me to a survivor who lived 45 minutes away from our house. He lived in Mobile. So my parents helped me track him down, set up interviews, write down a list of questions to ask him, and then they drove me over to his house so that I could interview him. There's a picture of him on the table over here. And that was the first time that the story really became more than just a history project for me. You know, I was still in very much the fact-finding part of this story. I had since read a few books, found a few microfilm articles. You know, I had a pretty good idea of what the story was, but Mr. Bell took it to a whole new level. Because that was the first time I really understood that there was more to the story, that there may be an injustice here that was not fully recounted in a lot of the books that I read. He showed me his Purple Heart. We went for a walk around his piece of property. We talked about fishing. And we spent the afternoon together and really developed a lifelong friendship. And he made the statement that he thought the captain of the Indianapolis was given, in his words, a bum deal, that he was court-martialed and never should have been court-martialed and that it wasn't his fault. And he couldn't prove it, but he didn't understand why it happened. I later found out that there were 436 ships lost at sea in World War II, and only one was court-martialed following the loss of his ship, and that was Captain McVay of the Indianapolis. So before I left, he gave me a list of all the other survivors. And I left with two things. One, with that list, and two, a goal that I wanted to do something to try to help these men. He also made the comment to me that 880 men died on the ship, and those men were never really appropriately recognized for their service at the end of World War II. After they delivered the bomb that was later dropped on Hiroshima that helped end the war. Because they were sunk and the Navy was embarrassed by the sinking, the Navy swept the story under the rug, never reported the ship overdue when they didn't show up in port. And he felt like between the captain being court-martialed unjustly and his shipmates who were lost at sea never receiving the recognition they deserved, I developed a conviction that I wanted to try to do something to help. So I took the list that he gave me and I went down the list and contacted, at that time there was 146 or 152, so around 150 survivors still remaining. I went down the list and I wrote 56 of them letters and questionnaires that my dad helped me come up with. What was your job on the ship? Where were you when the torpedoes hit? What did you think of the court-martial of the captain? And I got an overwhelming response. I had more than 40 survivors email me my questionnaires back. And the one thing that stood out was they all felt that their captain was court-martialed unjustly. They didn't have the words to describe it. It just didn't feel right. So I said, all right, well, the National History Fair competition is in Washington, D.C. It gets a lot of media and press attention. Maybe I can use this history fair. If I do a good enough job, I can make it to the National History Fair competition and use the media attention there to raise awareness for the story and hopefully get maybe some congressmen or some senators or government officials, put this on their radars, to garner interest and hopefully use history fair as a platform to do that. So I worked really hard. I finished first place at the school competition. And I was really bad at interviews at this time. But Miss Peach and my parents and so many of my other teachers were just constantly quizzing me to help me get ready. Because in addition, you can see this is the final version of the display board that I have over here. And it's a timeline of the events of the Indianapolis. The theme for the history fair this year was triumph and tragedy. And so the story needed to have both elements. And I felt that the Indianapolis triumphantly brought a quick end to World War II, but tragically, 880 men lost their lives. So I finished first at the school competition, first at the county competition, and then I was disqualified from the state competition. The history fair coordinator for the county at the time had given me an old copy of a copy of the rule book that was just a couple years out of date. And if you look on this table over here, you'll see two binders on the table. This is full of the research that I had done at the time, full of my interviews with the survivors, declassified documents, artifacts from the ship, letters of correspondence on and off the ship. I mean, just lots of primary sources. And the history fair coordinator said, hey, the judges will be impressed by the historical significance of the documents in these binders. You should lay them on the floor in front of your display board. Well, they had changed the rules since the rule book that I had in my hand, and you could no longer have a floor display in front of your display board. So after the state history competition, the judges took an easel and they put it by my project with the new section of the rules that were highlighted that floor displays were no longer allowed, and I was disqualified. And the girl that I had beat at the county competition placed first at state and was on her way to the national competition in Washington, D.C. And I was crushed. The place next to, the display board next to mine, I felt was getting more attention from the judges that I was. They didn't really ask me any questions. And I don't remember the exact theme, but it had something to do with rocks, because they had a whole bunch of rocks pasted to their display board. And I was crushed. And so my dad always knew how to cheer me up. I mean, I was in tears. So we walked across. This was at Florida State University. He walked me over to the track meet, get me outside in the sunshine, and said, hey, I know you had a mission to try to help these men, but it's not over yet. I don't know what the next step is, but, he firmly believed that we were on to something. A few weeks later at church, my mom started talking to Congressman Joe Scarborough, who was our freshman congressman at the time here in Pensacola. And I joined the conversation and started telling him about the research that I had done and the display board. And he made the suggestion, well, why don't you take this display board that you made and display it in my Pensacola office? There's a Navy town, a lot of naval history here. I think my constituents would enjoy it. A few weeks went by, and I got a phone call from him, and he said, Hunter, he said, this research project you have in my office, people are coming in from the community only to look at your project here. They're not even here to see me. What's going on? I said, well, if you have some time, I'd love to come in and tell you about it. Maybe there's some way that you could help. Now, in the meantime, while I was trying to figure out the next steps, I wrote letters, a letter writing campaign to government officials. I wrote President Clinton and asked if he would be willing to pardon Captain McVay. Now, that shows my ignorance at the time. By asking for a pardon was an admission of guilt, someone later told me. And so a pardon didn't really fit, but that's what I asked for at the time. My point is, I didn't really know exactly what I was doing, but I was willing to do whatever it took, even if it meant not asking the right questions or some inaccuracies along the way to get to the final goal. But the president's office wrote me back and said, many people have tried this before. We consider the case closed. I wrote a letter to the Secretary of the Navy, Secretary Dalton at the time. I think he and whoever from the president's office colluded, because I got very similar no responses from his office too. But I didn't let this deter me. And Joe Scarborough, Congressman Scarborough, ended up being another really powerful dream builder for me. Because I went to his office, I told him the story of the Indianapolis, and he said, well, I think I can help you do something about that. Now, I want to tell you about the Indianapolis before I go too far down this story. At the end of 1945, the Indianapolis delivered the atomic bomb. It had been hit by a kamikaze in Okinawa. It was in Mare Island Shipyard, which is a shipyard repair facility outside of San Francisco for repairs. Happened to be at the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, the Indianapolis was available after repairs. Because of her fast speed, she was picked to deliver the components for the atomic bomb to Tinian Island in the Pacific. And the mission was so secretive that they didn't even tell the captain the nature of the mission or the cargo that he was carrying. There was a big crate on deck in the Indianapolis, guarded by Marines 24/7. And then there was a little canister, which we now know was the uranium-235 core for the atomic bomb, that they welded to the deck in the captain's stateroom. And the rumor is that they told the captain, if the ship goes down and you have to choose between yourself and what's in that canister, you save what's in that canister. But they didn't tell him what it was, nor did they tell anybody else because the information was so secretive. So the captain made very quick speed to Tinian Island. They offloaded the components for the atomic bomb. They went to Guam for a fuel stop, and then they received orders to go to the Philippines to meet up with some other ships for some gunnery practice. There was some ambiguity in the Indianapolis's orders after they dropped off the atomic bomb. The other ships that the Indianapolis was supposed to rendezvous with didn't actually know that the Indianapolis was coming because the message wasn't transmitted correctly. On top of that, the port director in Guam sent the Indianapolis what we call unescorted. Cruisers at the time did not have the capability to detect enemy submarines. So it was customary in World War II that they would be accompanied by a destroyer escort, which could identify submarines. But the port director was told there's no threats. It's safe sailing from here to the Philippines. You have nothing to worry about. You can go alone. This was the first time I later learned that a heavy warship had made that crossing unescorted during the entire war. And as I later found out through research, the Navy actually knew that there were 3 submarines. We knew them by name. We were tracking their location because we had broken the Japanese code through the Enigma machine. And we knew 3 submarines by name that were operating where the Indianapolis was about to sail on what would become her final voyage. But since that information was so secretive, they didn't tell the captain, they didn't tell the port director, and a few days after the Indianapolis set sail, they were sunk by one of the same Japanese submarines that the Navy knew was in the area. On top of that, a battleship, the USS Underhill, had been sunk just 5 days before the Indianapolis set sail on almost the exact same route. They did not tell Captain McVay this information either. The Indianapolis, it was on the night they were sunk, it was just after midnight on July 30th, 1945. It was a very dark, cloudy, overcast night. Accounts from the survivors said it was so dark that you couldn't extend your hand in front of you topside and see it. There was a brief, by all accounts, 15 or 20-minute window when the moon broke through the clouds. The I-58, the submarine that sank the Indianapolis, happened to be surface and saw the silhouette of the USS Indianapolis on the horizon. Fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 2 of them hit the ship, and the Indianapolis sank in less than 12 minutes, which for a warship that fast, that big, 20,000-ton cruiser is pretty quick. That allowed for about 900 men to make it off the ship and into the water, where they waited for 4 days and 5 nights. Little did they know, no search party had ever been sent to look for them. When the Indianapolis didn't show up in port, they took the ship off it was a manual plotting board that showed the ships at the time. They were like, I don't know where the Indianapolis is. So they just took it off the plotting board and set it aside on the table. Never reported it overdue. Official Navy record when I started this research said they never received an SOS. And it was only on the 4th day that these men were accidentally spotted by a Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn, who was flying a PB-1 bomber over that area of the Pacific, and he had a busted radio antenna out of his window. So he was literally leaning out of his window trying to screw in this busted radio antenna, and he looked down at the water and he saw an oil slick. He was on a mission to bomb enemy submarines, so he notified his crew. They opened the bomb bay doors to get ready to drop a torpedo. And if you think about the men of the Indianapolis, they had given up on trying to wave down planes at this point. It had been 4 days. They had watched hundreds of their shipmates drown or be eaten by sharks or have hallucinations and swim off to an island in the sun's, in the distance, never to return again. Their energy level was low. They were all covered in oil. And so now they see a plane do this big loop because they've finally been spotted. And as the plane comes down, they see the bomb doors open. And many of these survivors said, our joy of potentially being spotted was overshadowed real quickly when they thought he was getting ready to drop a torpedo on them. But the closer they got, the crew saw heads bobbing up and down in the water and said, hey, there's men in this oil slick. They radioed for help. First to arrive was a seaplane flown by a pilot named Lieutenant Adrian Marks. He was the first on scene. It was 12-foot seas. He landed his seaplane in 12-foot seas and was able to pick 56 men up out of the water. He strapped them to the wings, throughout the fuselage, and the P-way to the tunnel to the cockpit, wherever, to the tail, wherever he could fit men. He motored around the water, picked up 56 of them, and saved their lives. Soon after that, rescue ships started to arrive on the scene. He offloaded them into the rescue ships. Then they were taken to ports all over the world for care. Well, 317 people survived the ordeal out of almost 1,200 on the ship. 880 men passed away. And the families of those men who passed away started asking the Navy, hey, what happened? Well, the Navy, honestly, wasn't quite sure because they lost track of the ship, basically after they dropped off after they left Guam, had lost track of the ship. One of the men who died on the Indianapolis, his father was a very powerful attorney who was friends with President Truman. He wasn't getting the answers that he wanted from the Navy, so he brought this up to the attention of President Truman, and President Truman tasked the Navy to look into it. The CNO at the time, the Chief of Naval Operations at the time, was Admiral Ernest King. And the President tasked Admiral King to look into it. There was some rumors at the time that Admiral King, when he was an ensign, was reprimanded by Captain McVay's father, who was a senior officer to him at the time. And so he knew and had a history with the McVay family. And the reality was there was a lot of mistakes that I would later uncover made in many theaters throughout the world that ultimately led to the sinking and forgetting of the Indianapolis. So Admiral King started to look into it. He appointed a court-martial authority. The trial happened very fast. Captain McVay requested a military attorney with a lot of trial experience. The court-martial authority denied his request for legal counsel, appointed him a junior attorney who had no trial experience. All the information that would have made a difference to defend Captain McVay was considered classified at the time, so the attorney didn't even have enough information to adequately represent him. They brought two, what we now know are bogus charges against the captain. One was failure to follow a zigzag pattern, that he hazarded his ship by failing to follow a zigzag pattern. And the other was that he failed to sound abandoned ship. Well, the second torpedo came very quickly after the first, knocked out power to the ship. So they had no way to sound abandoned ship other than by mouth because it took out the 1MC, which is the intercom for the ship. So they did that. And then his orders specifically gave him discretion to zigzag or not. So they found him guilty of the first charge, failure to zigzag, when his orders actually gave him the discretion to do that. Also, it was a dark night. He made the decision to cease zigzagging. They had been zigzagging up to that point so that they could make better speed to the area they were headed in the Philippines. So, captain was court-martialed, and the men worked for more than 50 years to try to overturn the court-martial decision. They tried petitioning the Navy, they tried writing their congressmen, but it had not yet been successful. As I started this research project, I began to find out other things that were withheld from the court-martial that would have made a difference. One of those was what I already told you, the declassified document that showed that the Navy knew where submarines were operating, even by name, the one that sank the Indianapolis. The other was that we being the Navy, had received an SOS in 3 different locations around the world that it actually did get sent out from the ship. In one, I have accounts. I was able to talk to each of these folks on duty with lots of help from people all around the world, talk to someone who's either on watch or on duty or had firsthand knowledge of each of these situations. One, the watchstander who received it had been drinking while on watch and passed out and didn't take any action. Another instance, they thought it was a prank by the Japanese to lure rescue vessels to the area. And so they wrote it off. And then in the third, a junior watch petty officer received the SOS message and initiated 2 tugboats to go out to the area where the Indianapolis SOS was calling from. The Commodore in charge, it turns out, had been playing bridge with some other officers there in Guam when this came in. And when he started looking into the petty officer's decision, he couldn't corroborate the SOS. There was no additional information. They asked for more information. Nothing came. So he ordered the tugboats back because they couldn't corroborate the SOS. So in all 3 instances, the official Navy record said that no SOS was ever received, but I was able to actually talk to people who received it. So I did this research. I was telling Congressman Scarborough this in his office, and I told him about the letters, and you can see displayed copies of the letters over on the display to the right. And he said, well, I think we might be able to help you out. What if we introduce legislation and let Congress help you out? I was like, I don't know anything about that. What would this legislation do? He said, well, it would direct the Navy to pull Captain McVay's naval record and either expunge it, remove it, or annotate in some way that the court-martial was a miscarriage of justice and never should have occurred. And then we can award a presidential unit citation for the final crew of the Indianapolis. It was many talks where we ultimately led to this legislation. So several members of his team helped draft this legislation. And the story started to garner some media attention now that Congressman Scarborough and the U.S. Congress was involved. And the media were really big, powerful dream builders in this quest. Chemo McVay is the youngest son of Captain McVay. He lived in Hawaii. He saw one of the media interviews that I was doing on a pretty random show. It was called TNN Primetime Country. He saw this from Hawaii and reached out to one of his friends, who was at one point one of the 50 most powerful people in D.C., a retired lobbyist. This friend of his is a guy named Mike Monroney. Mike and I became very good friends. Mike was in his 70s. Mike, it turns out, was in the Navy and had orders to go on the Indianapolis for what became their final voyage. But he got severely ill 2 days before the ship set sail and had to miss the underway period. And it had always haunted him that if he went out on that final mission that he never would have returned. So Chemo in Hawaii sees this interview on TNN Primetime Country. He calls his friend Mike Monroney in D.C. and says, hey, this kid's launching a legislative effort to try to exonerate my dad. Can you help him? So Chemo flew my family and me out to Hawaii to meet with him. Then we met with Mike Monroney. And Mike Monroney pulled out his Rolodex and started going through every congressman and senator he knew in D.C. to try to lobby to gain support for this legislation. Mike Monroney and Chemo were very powerful dream builders for me that enabled this success. And so we finished drafting the legislation. On the day that we were, a group of about a dozen survivors and I all met in Washington, D.C. to try to lobby Congress in support of this legislation that we introduced. Mike Monroney and Chemo had set up, dozens and dozens of interviews with meetings with congressmen and senators over the week that we had scheduled to be in Washington, D.C. And we were going to kick it all off with a press conference on the Capitol steps. Another dream builder, out of the blue, joined our efforts, and this was Congresswoman Julia Carson, a Democratic congresswoman from Indianapolis. So we had Congressman Scarborough from here, a Republican, and Congresswoman Julia Carson from Indianapolis, a Democrat, joined forces to champion this legislation. We gave a press conference, and the plan was that after the press conference, the survivors and I would walk up the Capitol steps, we would walk into the House floor, and that I would be able to personally drop the legislation into the hopper, which is a box that sits on the side of the Speaker's desk, where a formality where all legislation starts there. You drop it into the box, and that signals that you have officially introduced it to Congress. So we did the press conference, told about our mission, we walked up the steps, but when we got to the door of Congress, the security guard stopped us, and he looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, but you can't go in." Congresswoman Carson, African-American woman, stepped between us and said, "You can't tell him that, he's my son." And the security guard and I looked at each other just as confused as the other person, and he looked at her and he said, "Yes, ma'am." And he opened the door, we walked in, dropped the legislation in the hopper, and for what became the next 3 years, made many frequent trips back and forth from my house in Pensacola to Washington, D.C. to champion this legislation. But my research continued. While I was doing this, I was continuing to put together pieces of this puzzle that I felt would make a difference for Congress from all over the world. A Japanese journalist helped me get in touch with Commander Machitsura Hashimoto, who was the Japanese submarine commander who fired the torpedoes that sank the Indianapolis. At Captain McVay's court-martial, the Navy flew him from Japan to the United States after the war ended to testify against a U.S. Navy captain. In my discussions with Mr. Hashimoto, he said, I spoke English at the time of the court-martial, and at one point, when they asked me about zigzagging, the interpreter mistranslated what I said. I brought it to his attention, and he basically told me to shut up. He said, no. What I have said is good enough. And Mr. Hashimoto said, what I said, I think would have made a difference in the outcome of the court-martial, but the way he told me to be quiet, I felt that this thing, I felt that it might be contrived. I felt like I could potentially be a prisoner of war in a foreign country. It was not my place to speak up, and I didn't. But that has always haunted me for many years, even to this day. And so I asked him, I said, would you write a letter to the U.S. Congress saying that? And if you have a chance after this, his letter that he wrote to Senator John Warner, who was the chairman of the Armed Services Committee at the time, that is the letter that he wrote and provided to Congress. So we introduced the legislation over the next week, and then many times over the next few years, went back and forth to lobby for this legislation. We gained over 150 co-sponsors of the bill in the House, but when a senator tried to introduce it, Senator Inouye, a decorated veteran and senator from Hawaii, tried to introduce it. The Senate parliamentarian said that it violated a Senate rule which said that a senator cannot introduce legislation that will change or alter military history. The House had the same rule, but their parliamentarian didn't see any problem with it. But because a senator couldn't introduce the companion bill, it crushed the legislation. So now the president said no, the Secretary of the Navy said no, now Congress said no, the History Fair had no. I was running into no's after no's after no's, but fortunately I had wonderful parents, wonderful teachers, and a wonderful group of survivors who became like grandfathers to me that believed in this mission, none of whom would take no for an answer. So we went back to the drawing board, and Mike Monroney said, well, why don't we try a little bit different tactic? We introduced this as legislation, which would become law. Why don't we introduce this as a resolution? The difference between a resolution and a piece of legislation is that a resolution doesn't automatically become law once it's passed. It's just a statement. In this case, we wrote a statement urging the president to direct the Secretary of the Navy to expunge Captain McVay's naval record and award naval unit citation to the ship's final crew. So that's what we did. We reintroduced it in the next congressional session. We made many trips back and forth to D.C. to lobby for support for this legislation. And as the congressional session was drawing to a close, we were wondering if we were going to be able to get this legislation through Congress. Mr. Monroney had another idea. He and one of the senators who really became a dream builder for this and championed this cause, a guy named Bob Smith from New Hampshire, said, why don't we do this? We'll schedule a Senate hearing for you and the survivors to be able to tell your story before the Armed Services Committee. The Armed Services Committee was chaired at the time by Senator John Warner, who was a longtime Navy man. And afterwards, I'll save that part in a second. Senator Warner, longtime Navy man, and he brought this up, I think, as a favor to Senator Smith. So on the day of the hearing, on one side of this Senate testimony room, which looks very much like an official courtroom, on one side were 3 elderly survivors of the Indianapolis and me. On the other side of this Senate hearing was the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, who was a 4-star, the Chief Naval Historian, and the Chief JAG of the Navy, and then an entourage of 1-stars, 06s, and staffers. Fortunately, we got to speak first. And I told the story of the Indianapolis, of the court-martial of the captain, of the injustice that I felt had occurred. The survivors also told their story. Several senators had a chance to speak. Senator Smith even asking a question to the Navy where if the Indianapolis were not sunk by a Japanese submarine, would you still have court-martialed Captain McVay? A question that the Navy, there was no good answer to because the obvious answer is no. The Navy had a chance to defend themselves, but I had uncovered so much new information over the previous years. When the Navy murder boarded this, which is part of their preparation process for a big testimony like this, I had made my research available to the information of the Navy, made my research available to the Navy, but it was clear that they had not looked at it because the Navy, quite honestly, was not prepared to defend the case like the 3 survivors and I were. Senator Warner told me afterwards that he brought this legislation to a hearing as a favor to Senator Smith. He had done a little bit of research, walked in fully prepared to support the view of the Navy, but he told everyone there present in the room, he used the words, "I have righted my course," meaning now he was supporting the survivors and I on our quest to exonerate the captain and restore honor to the crew. Then Senator Warner took this cause and personally championed it. The hearing was a huge victory and shift in momentum for the survivors and me. And what we ended up doing, a little sneaky legislation tactic, is we attached the resolution to the Armed Services Appropriation Measures that year. So when the budget for the military passed, this resolution passed with it. President Clinton signed it in October of 2000. And it did 2 things. It finally restored justice to the captain and said that his court-martial was a miscarriage of justice and never should have occurred. And then they attached the legislation that we had written to his official military record. So the court-martial still stands on his military record, but the U.S. government, through Congress and the president, acknowledged that that court-martial never should have happened and that it was a miscarriage of justice. And the second thing that it did was it awarded a very high honor, a naval unit commendation, to the final crew of the Indianapolis to finally recognize their service at the end of World War II. 1 week before the legislation was signed, I had an opportunity to talk to Kimo McVay again, as he was very ill on the day that he passed away. And I was able to reassure Kimo. I said, "Kimo, I think we're close. I think this legislation is going to pass and be signed any day now." And I got to, share a bit of closure to the story with Captain McVay's youngest son. Sure enough, the legislation passed, and many years of research finally paid off, with huge thanks to so many dream builders along the way. So I share with you this story for a few reasons. One, to continue to tell the story of the heroic men who served aboard the USS Indianapolis. It is absolutely incredible what they went through at the end of World War II and what 317 of them survived. To hear the stories, even to this day, is just a really special, incredible moment for me to have been a part of their story and a part of their lives. 2, it's to emphasize that one person can make a difference, and we do that with the support of others. President Obama famously said, "None of us got here alone," and that was certainly the case for this research project, to have such wonderful, wonderful mentors, teachers, and dream builders all along the way who enabled me to just follow my curiosity. Even though I wasn't good at interviews, they helped me sharpen up. I wasn't good at bibliographies, but they forced me to do it. I just learned so much along the way from so many people that I am eternally grateful for. And the one final reason I tell this story is I want to try to use it to inspire the younger generations to military service. I have been extremely blessed with a career in naval aviation, a career that honestly I would not have embarked on this journey without the men of the Indianapolis. Because nobody in my immediate family was in the military, nobody in my even extended family was in the Navy. I had a few. My grandfather was conscripted in Korea, and I've had a few other distant family members serve here and there. But for me, despite being raised in the cradle of naval aviation, I didn't have any direct influences who served that would lead me down this road. But that influence came from the survivors of the Indianapolis. I was so impressed by their service, and still am to this day, that I decided I wanted to make a career of it myself. And so for any young people out there, if you're looking, I would strongly, strongly encourage you to look at a career in the military. It's something that I'm very proud of. The Navy has afforded me so many opportunities to travel and see the world and experience other cultures and learn new things and meet new people, that I would encourage any of you thinking about it to do it. And if you have any questions, please come talk to me afterwards. With that, I want to say thank you again to the museum and the board, Admiral Hall, everybody who made this possible. Thank you very much. This was an unbelievable honor that wouldn't have happened without you guys. So thank you very much.
Wow, that was a phenomenal story. And luckily we have a couple minutes left for some questions. So if there's any questions out in the audience that you'd like to ask Commander directly, please go ahead and do it.
The question was, what does it mean to be cleared of all charges? In this case, it was a recognition by the United States government that the court-martial never should have occurred. While the court-martial does still stand on his record, it is now in his naval record and the public file that that court-martial was a miscarriage of justice and was executed wrongly. Yep. Yes. Where did the torpedoes hit? The first one hit approximately midship, and the second hit where they stored all the ammunition on the ship. And so it's one of the reasons that the ship sank so fast, because the torpedo hit all the ammunition, ignited all that other ammunition, caused even bigger hole in the ship when the other ammunition went off, and that's why the ship sank so quickly. Good question. Yes, blue shirt. The question was, why didn't they exonerate Captain McVay immediately after the trial? There's a lot to that answer. The best I can think was this was a black eye for those currently serving in the Navy at the time. The Navy lost track of a warship that delivered the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima at the end of the war. They never sent a search party to look for the men. The men were accidentally spotted and rescued, and the Navy couldn't answer questions. They withheld the story from the press for weeks until the day of the end of the war. There was mistakes made Navy-wide by people currently serving in the Navy, and ultimately, I'm guessing, Admiral King had been tasked by the president to look into this and to come up with answers. It was extremely unlikely that he would be willing to accept the blame for this on the Navy. And then there's also a bit of history. Traditionally, Navy tradition, as the captain of a warship, you were responsible for all things that happened on that ship. So it wasn't out of the line in any normal circumstance that the captain would be held responsible. It's just, in this case, he made all the right decisions, and it turns out he was not responsible. That his orders actually gave him discretion to zigzag. Great question, thank you. Yes, red shirt. What did the Senate Armed Services hearing reveal that was not known before? That was a chance for me to tell Congress much of the research that I told you guys about Commander Hashimoto, his letter to Senator Warner. about the 3 SOSs that was received, about the declassified information that showed that we knew that submarines were in the water and still sent the Indianapolis unescorted anyway. I had a chance to tell the entire story in great detail to the senators who were present at the meeting. And I think that's what made the difference in us getting this legislation passed. Yes, sir, black shirt.
How far was the submarine when they launched the torpedoes?
Oh, I don't remember. I think, is Kim Roller here? How far away was Kim Roller is an honorary survivor of the USS Indianapolis. She has done a lot to tell their story and champion their cause. I think it was within 800 yards. Do you remember how far the Indian? Yeah, about 800 yards. Good question. All right, we'll go over here and then I'll come back. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I'm Cadet Lieutenant Colonel Brown, and my question is, did Captain McVay's exoneration change how the Navy
Operated, yeah. Is that? Yes. So one of the things that came after the Indianapolis sinking was a formal process to keep track of ship called move reps. It is an official message that the Navy sends out that talks about the point of the departure, the date and time, the destination, and everything, and the exact route at every point in between. And if you go so far off that route, you have to make an adjustment to your move rep. So the Navy completely changed the process for ship accountability as a result of the sinking of the Indianapolis. Excellent question. Why did the Indianapolis not have the sonar capability? It was just, unfortunately, you can't put all the technology on every ship. Each ship is designed with a unique mission and purpose, and that's the way the cruisers were designed. And that's the way destroyers were designed, is they were given that the sonar capability to detect submarines. Yeah, good question. Yes?
80 men properly recognized?
Yes, they were. They were all given the honor, or if they had, passed away either in the sinking or as a survivor in the years since then, their family was given the award on their behalf. All right, sir. All right, one final question. Right there, FSU shirt.
If they did face any charges, what charges did the people who ignored the SOS calls face?
To my knowledge, they never faced any charges. Captain McVay took the blame for all of it. With that, no more questions. I once again want to say this was a really special event and an honor for me to be here. Thank you all for attending. Thank you very much.
Wow. That was a phenomenal story, awesome questions. What impressed me the most, if you noticed where all the questions came from, that's impactful. If you can see that it came from this front group of young men and women, awesome job. You also heard Hunter talk a little bit about a term, dream builders, and there's been established a Dream Builder Scholarship. So I'd like to request Michael Jones to come up. And he is the History Department Chair for Pensacola High School, and he's here to present the Dream Builder Scholarship.
Good morning. My name is Michael Jones, and I'm the History Department Chairman at Pensacola High School. I'm also the History Fair Coordinator still, and I was Hunter's teacher when he was in the 10th grade. I always loved to be out here at the Naval Aviation Museum. I've been coming here since I was a kid. I am a Pensacola native, and one thing I like particularly about this atrium is my dad was a naval flight surgeon, and he soloed in that plane. So I always like to see that. It reminds me of my father. I'm honored to be here to be connected to this story of the USS Indianapolis and the story of Hunter's work in his History Fair project that took on a complete life of its own. And I'm glad many students can be here to be encouraged, hopefully for future History Fair projects and just history research, and that history is something that's not always set in stone. Things that were established facts can be revisited to find truth where truth has been obfuscated. About 10 years ago, I was contacted by Hunter's family and the family of the pilot that discovered the wreckage of the Indianapolis and the survivors. And with their help, we put together an endowed scholarship fund, the USS Indianapolis Hunter Scott Dream Builder Endowed Scholarship at Pensacola High School. It's an essay contest, and there's one winner for a $1,000 endowed scholarship. We alternate the themes each year, but they always connect to the Indianapolis, of course. Some of the themes have been righting a historical wrong, overcoming bureaucratic obstacles, heroism and valor, and service to one's country. This year focused on the miracle of the sighting, and the title of this year's winner is Against All Odds, the USS Indianapolis and the Apollo 13 Rescue, by a senior IB history student named Sophie Sarazin, who is with us this morning. If you would please come forward, Sophie. Oh, yes. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
And the legacy continues, so that is awesome. Speaking of legacies, it is my pleasure at this time I'd like to present a legacy wall plaque on behalf of the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation, Commander Hunter Scott, who, as a young man, took on a project that literally changed the lives of hundreds and hundreds of people. And not only that, really instilled a drive and an example of what determination can really do. So with that, I'd like to present this plaque to Commander Hunter Scott. Well, that concludes our program for today. Again, our deepest gratitude to all of you who have attended, our distinguished guests, Cash, awesome seeing you. So with that, just have a